Hey, welcome to No Way Out. I'm Brian Ponch Rivera. Today, I want to talk about a topic with Daniel Friedman. I'll introduce him to you in a moment. But I also want to go back and explain why we're looking at what we're going to look at today. And that is a quick conversation we had with Mary Ellen Boyd, the daughter of John Boyd. She pointed out that the majority of people that follow John Boyd's work do not truly understand what her father was trying to do with it. It is my strong belief that the topic of active inference and the free energy principle, and moreover, the key feature or a key feature that is often excluded when we talk about John Boyd's OODA loop is active inference. Now, this did not exist when John Boyd passed away in 1997. It came about in the early 2000s. We can talk more about that here in a second. But our guest today is Daniel Friedman. He is the co-founder and president of the Active Inference Institute. He is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of California, Davis. And he actually wrote a paper about conflict warfare and active inference, which is very powerful to review. If you want to get that link, we'll put that out for you as listeners. But Daniel Friedman, welcome to the show. And could you help us on a couple of fronts up front? And that is, can you tell us a little bit more about who you are, how you came into co-founding the Active Inference Institute, and then why is the topic of active inference and free energy principles so important to leaders in all types of organizations? So Daniel, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here. And I really like a lot of the previous conversations you had. So looking forward to where we go today. All right. I will look to those questions in a 1-3-2 order. First, I'll say who I am, and then the why of why active inference is so interesting and important to apply in an organizational setting, and then connect a little bit to how we founded Active Inference Institute. So first, I'm as you mentioned, a postdoctoral researcher at University of California in Davis. I went to Davis for my undergraduate, and I studied genetics and biology. I then went to Stanford for my PhD. I studied with Professor Deborah Gordon, collective behavior in ants. So I was doing a lot of field work in Arizona, counting ant foraging activity, dissecting ant brains, thinking about molecular biology, thinking about distributed systems and complex adaptive behavior in collectives. And during that time in graduate school, I started getting very interested in formal and statistical models of perception and action, because sense making and decision making are kind of like the inbound and the outbound on how systems work. And so whether that's like an individual in terms of our own self-efficacy and self-development, or it's a team in terms of how the team forages for information and integrates it and then takes decisions and makes productive outcomes relating to that, or it's an organization, this kind of cybernetic sense-making on the inbound, decision-making on the outbound structure is pervasive, it's non-contentious, and it's kind of like the esoteric yet in plain sight mystery that also Boyd spoke to in the OODA loop. What is it that happens between observation and action? And so that is the cognitive moment. That's the action perception loop. And it's the mystery with 1,000 names. So it's really exciting to see how it's being now tackled in this current time using active inference and some new techniques. But that's the who and how I got to this place, which was studying distributed biological systems, also curious about human systems, and wanting to study more about the state of the art and the best in class in terms of thinking about cybernetic systems. Okay, now as to the Active Inference Institute. So during 2020, along with some colleagues, we were looking at the rapidly developing literature on active inference and free energy principle. And we were seeing applications ranging from clinical psychiatry to kind of Gaia scale nested Markov blankets all the way down. And we thought, wow, there's actually one system that's every day coming into play It's super important for all aspects of our world today, and yet it doesn't have a direct active inference bridge, and that was remote teams and organizations. And so in 2020, we wrote a paper about active inference in the context of remote teams, communication, and organization. And in September 2020, when we finished that paper, we thought, wow, that's a great pointer and vision. However, the technical debt, the research debt, which is to say the delta between the promises and the potential of the framework, generalized unifying framework for sense making and action, and then the capacities and the actual applications that exist on the ground, we saw that differential as being large and growing. And so we wanted to take a direct education, research, and service-oriented approach to tackle that differential between active inference in principle and active inference in practice. And so we founded the Active Inference Lab, which then kind of developed into the Active Inference Institute. And since the beginning of 2021, we've been on quite a journey in our role in the active inference ecosystem.
That's awesome. One of the connections you made there on the team side of the house, it's interesting to hear that that's how you kind of found this pathway. One of the things we're doing now is using active inference the way we understand it to help organizations understand how each team member perceives reality. And then from that, we can start to really invite good practices that scale solid teamwork skills. So things like, how do we mitigate cognitive biases? How do we make things visible? How do we create situational awareness? So some of the things that are in your paper with the Inslee model, where does effects-based operations, which is based on value-focused thinking, fit in the context of the Cynefin framework? So it's amazing that what we started with years ago has now shifted from let's start with the big frameworks and start with that, to starting with how humans perceive reality and showing people through like a Stroop exercise, showing different colors and things like that, or inattentional blindness images, or images that help them see that they only see what they expect to see. And we are able to explain how that perception is created or constructed top down, inside out. And that is it's amazing you had that connection with teams. And I thank you for that paper from 2020. It's really nice. So Daniel, we got to get down to the basics here. All right. And it's kind of a heavy topic. I've been reading about it for the last 3 years now. I'm still pretty new at it. My connection to John Boyd's OODA loop begins with mismatches, which is, I believe, another way to say surprise. So can you help us understand the free energy principle and active inference in your own words, and walk us through what does the free energy mean? What are we trying to do there?
Great. Well, there's so many on-ramps and play toys in this space. There's no one pedagogical path, and that's kind of the beauty of the wayfinding in the ecosystem. But I'll jump in exactly where you asked, which is, what is the relationship between mismatch or differential, surprise, and free energy? And these terms, mismatch or differential, surprise, and free energy, are going to be distinct. However, they will be aligned in a way where if you understand one, you're definitely pointing in the right direction in all of them. I'll also just note that the language that I'm speaking here is the active inference ontology. And we have this translated into a variety of programmatic and natural languages, because this entire journey is about the accessibility, rigor, and applicability of the framework. It isn't a implicit knowledge. We work every day to make these kinds of connections and questions, incredible questions like you're bringing up, make them clear, make them available. So mismatch, or an error differential, is denominated in the units of what is being compared. For example, if you expect it to be 40 degrees and the temperature reading comes back as 45 degrees, the mismatch or the differential is +5. And so mismatch or differential denominated in the units of whatever it is that you're measuring. Now, if you have a statistical distribution about what you expect, another way to think about that incoming thermometer reading is in terms of how surprising it is. And so 45 would be somewhat surprising. If we expected 40, that would be the least surprising. And if we got 100, that would be even more surprising. And so in that way, surprise is denominated in information theoretic units like nats or bits, but it can also be thought of basically like a z-score, like how many standard deviations are you in terms of temperature, but that's not denominated in units of temperature. That's in units of information theory. So when you minimize the differential, you also minimize surprise. However, they're not denominated in the same units, but again, you can imagine if things are coming exactly as you expect back to you, your surprise is minimized because the differential is minimized.
Yeah.
Now, surprise minimization is a great heuristic for Bayesian statistics. The reason being because when surprise is minimized, model evidence is maximized. However, for real-time settings or with large data sets, surprise calculation directly is not always tractable. And so what free energy is it's a bound on surprise. So it converges to surprise, it bounds surprise. However, free energy is incrementally optimizable. And so that allows us to transform a very challenging plug and chug type, big computation, do it once and you're done with it, surprise, into this real-time accelerated optimization problem on the variational free energy. And this is exactly what's used in variational Bayesian methods like variational autoencoder or variational Bayes or energy-based learning or evidence lower bound. And so what active inference is doing is it's using variational methods, which have been in use for decades and all over the world today, using variational methods on the cybernetic synthesis of sense-making on the inbound and decision-making on the outbound. And so to kind of close that, when the differential is 0, the surprise is the lowest and the free energy is minimized. A non-zero divergence means that it's not minimized surprise, which means that you're going to have also a higher free energy. And so what we do is we pursue via optimization on free energy bounds on minimizing surprise, and that supports the differential being reduced. So again, they're not the exact same thing. However,
Okay.
differential surprise and free energy are all kind of cousins.
That's a great explanation. And I appreciate that. I'm going to try to bring this to a knucklehead perspective from fighter aviation. All right. And I might use biomimicry or automimicry. So this might, please correct me if I'm getting it wrong. So in nature, animals will paint themselves or have a different color on them to show that they're bigger or smaller. In fighter aviation, at one point many years ago, we used to paint a canopy on the underside of an aircraft, right? And that way, when you saw it in the air, you couldn't tell which direction it was heading, or you're looking at the top side or bottom side. That to me was a mismatch. We're creating a mismatch in the environment to slow down my decision-making loop, right? To kind of put some doubt in it, to put some novelty in it, to really go, do I really understand what I'm seeing here? That's one aspect of it. For most people who've seen the first movie, Top Gun, and this sounds kind of funny, the radar could only pick up one aircraft. Remember, if you remember this, ready to go visual ID them. When you get to that merge and you see that there's two aircraft there, that's surprising. It's even more surprising when there's a third aircraft there, right? So our ability to make sense further out in an environment in warfare, in this case, fighter aviation, many years ago, we wanted to minimize that surprise. We wanted to send somebody close to visually identify them to understand what we're up against. And I think the same thing is true in organizations today. Is they have to be working, or they have to have a closed loop with their external environment. They have to have some type of sense-making capability to understand what that feedback is coming what's in that feedback that's coming from the external environment. So I think hopefully I'm kind of making sense of what you just shared with us. How's that resonate with you, Daniel?
Yeah. In
Okay.
terms of us wanting the best for ourselves and our organizations, we want to bound or minimize surprise. Now, that doesn't mean eradicate novelty or creativity or
Mhm.
innovation. It means we don't want the kind of negative surprise that we would associate with basically a lack of situational awareness and an increase in risk and essentially threats to cognitive security. So that's the kind of surprise that you want to avert.
Yeah.
And in pursuit of that, part of it might include techniques that intervene in the sense making or decision making of another cognitive agent in the
Right.
ecosystem. And so camouflage or different kinds of cues could be understood as de-risking or deceiving or confusing other cognitive agents. And so that speaks to using active inference, even qualitatively, as a way to think about the kinds of sense making and decision making engagements that do occur, whether we're talking about a social setting or professional setting or any other kind of setting. If we can pull back and understand these entities as cybernetic systems with that inbound perception and the outbound action, whether it's a computer, a person, or a team, then this helps us compose those cognitive ecosystems in really legible and modular interpretable ways.
Okay. So if I understand the free energy principle correctly, we try to minimize surprise as agents, and an agent being something that can plan, I believe that's a basic definition potentially, or we try to maximize evidence or information for our own internal model. Is that what we're trying to do with free energy?
Yes, I'll just add the half caveat that not
Sure.
all agents engage in planning.
Right.
So, a very simple active agent like a metronome might engage in action. However, it doesn't engage in explicit prospective planning as inference. It's not engaging counterfactuals about what would happen if that happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so that kind of sophisticated inference is possible to describe within this broader umbrella of free energy principle. But what's really cool about free energy principle is it also takes us down to describing even inert or really simple active systems. So it doesn't need to always go into this very, very complicated space of different cognitive phenomena, but it can.
Mm-hmm.
It also is grounded in like a baseball doing a parabola.
Yep.
Well, that's the least surprising trajectory that the baseball can take. And that's called the path of least action. Path of least action doesn't mean path of least movement. It means given the initial conditions of that baseball, that parabola is what physics predicts.
Yeah.
Free energy principle is a principle of least action for cognitive systems. I know there's a lot to unpack there, but the
That's
same
great.
way that when you roll a ball down a hill or when a baseball goes on a parabola, the path it takes, whether you like it or not, is a path of least action. The free energy principle, is a principle of least action in information geometric spaces for cognitive systems.
Awesome. There's a episode we did with John Flack, and we talked about baseballs, and I think it's a solid connection between how we actually catch a ball as a human system. And I think it's the same thing with machine. Okay, I want to move a little bit towards active inference, and the way I want to frame this right now is within John Boyd's OODA loop, there are four pathways that are often excluded when people think about John Boyd's OODA loop. The first pathway is the implicit guidance and control pathway that moves from orient back to observe. And that, in my view, in our view, that's perception. That's our schema, our mental models of the external world. That's constructed, by the way. The second one is the pathway that moves from decision or decide, which is also known as hypothesis. And I think a hypothesis or a decision can also be known as a prediction. But that pathway moves from decide back to observe, and it's a feedback loop, right? It's a feedback loop there, or feedback pathway, however you want to frame that. The third would be the pathway that moves from act back to observe. So that's, the first being implicit guidance control, the second one, decision back to observe, the third, act back to observe. And then finally, we have what I believe is an external loop, which moves from act back to observe. It goes back through the environment, through our external world. That's our closed loop there. So with that frame in mind, and one thing I want to share with you, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, when John Boyd initially, I hate to say created it, but when he was trying to figure out what to call his loop, he actually wanted to call it the SOTA loop, for sense, orient, decide, and act, where orient is clearly the Schwerpunkt, the most important aspect that helps us make sense of the world, decide, and act in it. It's the, you can call it an internal model of the external world, or what he called orientation. So that's the frame I think most people get wrong when they draw the OODA loop. They draw it as a linear approach, like plan, do, check, act, right? And that's not the way John Boyd drew it. So I want to know if you can help us, through the active inference lens, understand what is actually going on through when humans perceive reality. I don't know if you can, or maybe there's another way to talk about that.
Well, it's an awesome question and a very exciting avenue. In 2021, with my colleagues Scott David and RJ Corday in Cognitive Security, in our active inference and modeling conflict paper, we tried to look at the type of generative model that we use in active inference, and then schematically show where these different phenomena of the OODA loop are kind of loaded onto the active inference generative model, which is a partially observable Markov decision process, or a POMDP. They both describe the same territory, or they both are like two different.
Before we dive into that, can you just go over two things? Markov, and I think you said POMP. Is that correct?
Yeah, POMDP. Okay.
Okay.
So there's two aspects to the POMDP. There's the PO and the MDP. The PO is partially observable. Partially observable means that our model is dealing with observables like temperature readings, but not everything that we care about is an observable. For example, the true temperature in the room is not an observable, though the thermometer readings are. Or latent causes in the world might not be directly measured, but they're like hidden causes that give rise to sensory observations. So a partially observable model just means that it's going to be certain parts are data-driven and can be connected to sensors. Other parts are going to be so-called hidden states or latent factors, and those are going to be modeled, but they are not going to be associated with a sensor reading. That's partially observability. Now, Markov decision process. My personal feeling is that last names do not need to be attached to different equations because it gets really confusing. First off, there's multiple Markovs. Second off, they both worked on multiple things mathematically. And so I wish that we could just describe things sometimes with their technical details to be more rigorous and clear, actually. So Markov gets thrown around, and it does mean slightly different things in different settings. The Markov property, when talking about a time series, is the idea that the past can only influence the future through the present. So that's a Markovian property, is basically that the present insulates the past from the future. So there's no skipping the present forwards or backwards in time. But it turns out that that Markovian property on a time series is an example more generally of what is called a Markov blanket. And a Markov blanket is a node in a Bayesian graph that makes two other sets of nodes conditionally independent. And so in the time case, that is the same thing as saying each instant is like a blanket that insulates the past and the future, making them conditionally independent, so that only through the eye of the needle in the present does the past influence the future. But also Markov blankets can play roles in other systems. And so Markov decision process is a statistical model that includes a perceptual and, importantly, a decision-making component from control theory and follows this Markovian property. So partially observable Markov decision process, observables and non-observables, in a sense-making and decision-making task. That's why this is kind of a standard form for thinking about cybernetic systems when we're doing statistical modeling.
Okay. I'm going to slow down again. So cybernetics. Now, this is, and I don't want to keep you from your rhythm here. There are a lot of terms that are being thrown out here, and I think this is kind of important because we need to connect. A lot of people may not understand cybernetics, and if I understand it correctly, we got into. Let me just try this. We need an internal model of the external world. That's kind of the basics of cybernetics. Can you build on that, or amplify that, or dampen that?
Cybernetics arose to explain a huge diversity of adaptive or goal-oriented systems. And so whether it was thinking about the guidance systems of ballistics, or whether it was thinking about a bacteria looking for sugar in its niche, or a person looking for some kind of information, cybernetics is like a really general framework to talk about adaptive agent behavior. And so by cybernetics, I'm referring to the type of agent, the type of thing, again, whether it's software or physical, augmented, heterogeneous, all the adjectives you want, but we're highlighting that this is some kind of thing that has an inbound sense-making capacity, some internal processes that we call cognition, and some outbound action selection capacity that we associate with decision-making and cause it back into the niche.
Okay. No, thank you for that. And this is foundational to John Boyd's work too. He studied this in the 50s, 60s, actually more in the 70s. Okay, back. Sorry to interrupt your flow.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure we get those right because our listeners may be scratching their head going, what does that mean? What does this mean? To me, a Markov blanket could be just a boundary. And we had Adrian Bejan on the show, Professor Bejan from Duke. He talked about boundaries in physics. Dr. Enos Hippolito talked about the boundaries, the Markov blankets. Hopefully our listeners are somewhat familiar with that concept. And then something we propose is that when you put a blanket or a boundary around John Boyd's OODA loop, you end up with a action perception loop. And going back to an earlier point, it's the stuff that happens inside. And that's what we're going to talk, I believe we're going to talk about with active inference now, correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes. Awesome. These are all awesome guests, and Dr. Hippolito and colleagues are doing some fascinating work with dynamical Markov blankets and all these other features. So to come back to the OODA loop, again, OODA loop, active inference, and really any other cybernetic type model of the action perception loop, whether it's TOTE or any other kind of like cyclic or spiral-like model that's describing sense-making and perception and action. They're describing the same territory. You could apply one of those models like a lens or a filter onto the pilot in the cockpit. You could also apply it to the person doing knowledge work. You could apply it to the ant foraging for a seed in principle. So the territory is not the map. The map is not the territory. These are different maps that can be projected or made about a given territory or system of interest, something that Toby Smythe from the category theory side calls compositional cognitive cartography. And I love that because it brings together the cognitive system of interest, the compositionality from category theory, and cartography or map making. And so it's like we're making maps of settings. Now there's archival maps that try to capture all of the information about a given system, and there's itinerary maps that capture how to get from A to B in a really efficient way by abstracting or coarse graining across other pieces of information. And our digital systems today allow us to reimagine maps and blur the line between the archive and the itinerary, because the itinerary can be re-rendered on demand. So think about using a maps application. You can add a new stop, or you can say search for this kind of thing in my area. Active inference gives us a really powerful statistical framework to talk about the OODA loop and all of those neglected edges that connect back to observation. Those are all super important phenomena to have situational awareness about. However, just bringing awareness to the phenomena by itself doesn't give us the computational framework to actually make simulations, digital twins, unique explanations and predictions, and so on. And so I see Boyd's work as absolutely singular and so far-sighted in some ways scoping out design patterns and principles for cognitive systems, as well as forsaging the synthesis of thermodynamics and information theory. But these edges that you describe, then the challenge kind of comes back to us after this ontology mapping has been done. How do we bring awareness to these loops that you describe? And how do we do that in a way that isn't just like a hot take, but rather in a way that brings integrity between the natural language, the graphical visualization, and the executable cognitive simulation? That's what I call the triple play.
Okay. It's pretty powerful. So what's behind active inference is sound statistics, mathematics. It kind of unifies a lot of different thinking from biology, perhaps complex adaptive systems, cybernetics. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think it does.
Okay.
And that is not exactly a double-edged sword, but because it's so grounded in measurement and the capacity to describe and simulate systems, it by itself is not a normative principle about what one should do. You could describe a failing business with active inference. You could describe a car driving off a cliff. You could describe a fighter pilot falling out of the sky. So the ability to describe is not enough, but the ability to describe brings us to the vista of decision-making as individuals and as organizations. And so it can describe anything with persistence. We can describe, whether it's a rock, metronome, thermometer, heating system, or a more sophisticated cognitive system, we can develop a map of that thing to our heart's content.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that the map that we make is going to be useful. It doesn't mean our little car is going to be able to drive on that dirt road just because the maps application told us that we could or should.
Right.
And so this is really the work and the opportunity and the challenge, which is to go from a generalized theory of things, active inference and the free energy principle, and apply it with integrity in an adaptive way.
Okay. All right. So active inference, if I understand it correctly, we do not passively observe the external world, right? We actively engage with it, and that's what the active inference piece is within it. And that's what I believe John Boyd's OODA loop tells us with those three pathways that I pointed out. There's going to be four pathways I pointed out. So let me kind of walk you through a basic understanding. So our sensory organs pick up some type of signal from the external environment. Those signals get not necessarily a signal. It's like a photon or a molecule or something external. Those sensory organs, which we'll call observations, they in turn create a sensory signal that goes into some type of internal map of our external world. That internal map of the external world generates a prediction about the causes, which I believe are hidden states. Correct me if I'm wrong, that are behind the signals that it's receiving. Right. So can you help correct me, or am I on the right path on that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So you mentioned kind of using these micro experiences to help people understand this active sensing component. So here's two fun little micro experiences.
Sure.
Put your finger on a surface, any surface, fabric or something on your desk. Is the surface rough or smooth? Turns out you can't reduce your uncertainty about that without moving your finger, because it's not a property that's revealed by a stationary finger. So
great.
Active sensing. Another example of active sensing that's very embodied is our visual system. So our visual system has very high resolution color image in the very center of the visual field. However, off center, there is lower resolution and there's less color vision. Also, we have a fairly large blind spot, literally, on our retina. But that does not play into our visual experience. Additionally, eye saccades, which happen several times a second, are suppressed so that we see a fixed visual field, even though a camera that you moved a bunch of times a second, it would look extremely chaotic. So all these phenomena, from the sort of continuity of our attention with eye saccading to the high resolution color and no blind spot visuals that we see in our visual field, these are evidence that help us understand that our perception, our experience, our situational awareness is a generated model that is fine-tuned by incoming sensory data, which may be very partial or sparse. So it's not that we're getting this rich data and processing it, distilling it, and then getting to the nugget of insight. Rather, it's like the generative model of the brain or the team is the insight machine that's always in motion, being fine-tuned by sensory inputs. Now, what is that insight machine? What is that generative model? It includes predictions about current and future observations and hidden states.
You hit on something here. Predictions about current and future. So I think we touched on the current. So the sensory signals that are coming in, we're making predictions about that, minimizing surprise. I think, or John Boyd put it as new information or information. So we're trying to minimize that. And I think the idea behind this is our brains are very expensive organs. They burn a lot of energy. 2% of our body weight weighs 20%, excuse me, 2% of our body weight burns 20% of our energy, something like that. Therefore, this is a low energy approach to find efficiencies within our organs, within our brain, to perceive the external world. I guess the other case would be if our sensory organs were picking up everything, we'd be overwhelmed and we'd probably die, right? I don't know if that's true or not. So back to the current, and then back to the future. Inside of our mind or our brain or in an agent that plans, there's a planning mechanism. I think it's called a policy, and I believe you pointed out that it's a covert plan. It's internal to that agent or system, and it's a counterfactual or a what if, right? Am I getting that correctly?
Yeah, awesome point. Okay. So first off, we're now casting. This is the temporal thickness of the moment. Visual input and sonic input are happening at slightly different staggered times, milliseconds different, but the temporal thickness and the temporal continuity of the now, or the primal impression, is this generative model that has those things seamlessly integrated, coarse-grained, and so on. So it's not just that we're like perceiving the now directly, but then the past and the future are hypotheticals. There's a continuity between the past, present, and future because it's all part of what the generative model is predicting. So whether it's recalling or accessing memory, whether it's now casting in the unfolding moment, or whether it's projecting or protenting towards expected futures, these are all integrated activities of the generative model. Now, what is that cognitive capacity of planning? And how do we approach planning as inference? So let's think about a chess computer. It has a defined set of moves. It has the rules of the game built in. And then at certain depths or time horizons, it can play out all possible futures. Now, even within the game of chess, the combinatorics get really out of control. And so you need all of these computer science techniques to like prune the trees that you do end up exploring. This is just to give a kind of guide to the way that policy selection occurs in active inference. So the all by all space of a long time horizon, all possible actions is very vast. And the challenge is, first off, just to sift through that space, but more to the point of cybernetic and adaptive systems is to make adaptive actions and to select adaptively within that space. And what happens in policy planning is in active inference, again, this is map, not territory. So this is not necessarily how a given system does policy planning. This is an analytic framework that we can apply as an ethologist, as a behavioral researcher, to describe any system. So we don't need to wait for systems that are from their heart on out applying active inference themselves. We can apply this to a tiger today or to some other information framework today. Policy planning is modeled as basically evaluation of counterfactual futures. And those counterfactual future paths are evaluated in terms of expected free energy. And the expected free energy has two components: epistemic value, pragmatic value. Epistemic value, how much will I learn by taking this path? Pragmatic value, how well will my preferences be satisfied by taking this path? And so when epistemic value is off the table, there's nothing to learn, this model becomes essentially a utility-seeking equation. Conversely, when pragmatic value is off the table, we only have epistemic value, then we seek maximum information and novelty. But for situations with both epistemic and pragmatic value on the table, expected free energy gives a really finessed way to navigate the explore-exploit trade-off.
This is great. So the application of this from the individual, even from a neuron, but most of our clients are not neurons, they're humans. So from the human level, from the individual level to a team level and organizational level, the application of active inference is almost, I'm going to say universal. It's self-similar, right? I mean, it scales, it's almost scale free, right?
Yeah, it's scale independent. The framework is not based around a certain spatial or temporal scale or system of interest, which is, again, why there's so much work in the application,
right?
Because the framework itself doesn't respond or require any specifics of any system of interest, which is why some people are frustrated with the generality of the principle and of the framework. But I just see that as the opportunity to actually make it go the last mile and apply it to systems of interest that we actually care about, work on every day.
Okay. So business leaders listen to this podcast and they are talking about VUCA or uncertainty, so volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. We talked about mismatches, FEP, a little bit earlier. Is it okay to say that at the organizational level, when we do some type of policy planning, a counterfactual work, or we're doing some design thinking or complexity thinking, we're trying to figure out how we can minimize uncertainty? Can we say that?
Yes, we could think about, given the generative model of our organization, the imperative is to bound surprise. Again, that doesn't mean eradication of novelty, because we could define the generative model to mean our bank account incrementally increases at this rate and our product usage increases at this rate. And if it's increasing it this way, we'll be minimizing surprise. We'll be fulfilling our preferences. Those policies will have high pragmatic value. Those policies or some other policies may have high epistemic value because they'll help us refine our world model so that we can make better pragmatic decisions as well. And so all those policies, the more research, epistemic, exploratory, and the more kind of locking in, fine-tuning, making the observations align with our preferences today, pragmatic value, both of those can be spread out and evaluated with a common currency on the same table.
Okay.
And I'll point to Bijan Hazri, who has written his PhD dissertation, which was published as a textbook-like publication. And it is an incredible modern work on free energy governance. And it's just the beginning of what will be one of the areas of applying active inference in the active inference ecosystem to organizational design and re-understanding previous management, professionalization, and organizational operations within the context not of reward and reinforcement learning, but rather within the modern cognitive science and cognitive security approaches that we have today.
Yeah. So I'll tell you right now that one of the challenges we have is all these different models and frameworks, they confuse folks, right? So anything that is a unifying model that can help people understand and not simplify the world, but make sense of their environment, I think invites the right interventions for their current context. So we can look at the Cynefin framework, we can look at John Boyd's OODA loop, we can look at Ensley's situational awareness, and so forth. I want to shift gears a little bit here and kind of touch on the paper you wrote about on conflict, and there's a and there's some context to this as well. So fifth generation warfare is being talked about quite a bit these days. Disinformation, misinformation. You can think of it as manipulation and the environment, propaganda, whatever it may be. Social media is accelerating this. Active inference and fifth generation warfare. Is there a strong correlation or connection there?
Yeah, this is a very good and a very deep question. For those who have different familiarities, the 1, 2, and 3 generations of warfare, first off, as we described in this active inference and modeling conflict paper, these are not chronological. And so it's not that these were different epochs of history and now we're in a different epoch of history, but we can understand all of these generations as kind of being like archetypes that are playing out in different situations, in different ways, different contexts. And whereas the lower numbered generations of warfare are referring to the most boots on the ground, the most physical and infrastructural, these higher numbers, 4, 5, however one wants to think about this, increasingly engage with cognitive and informational conflicts, and ultimately just informational communication overall. Because one of the complexities of fourth and fifth generation warfare is, for example, the gray zone and the ambiguity around what kinds of actions even are aligned. Because we all know of situations in our teams and organizations where, like, all the good intentions in the world, all the right types of thought diversity, all of the right types of thought resonances don't translate to effective action. And one can imagine that adversaries are able to threaten the cognitive security in terms of the perception and action selection of individuals and groups. And those threats on cognitive security, threats to sense making and decision making, are, if we use the warfare framing, considered fourth and fifth generation warfare. And so as people are saying, yes, there's the physical, yes, there's physical security. You lock your door when you go outside. Yes, there's the digital. Yes, there's the digital security, encryption, and the DDoS, and all of these things that computer systems do. But what is the interface and what is the leverage point that we have as biological creatures? What is a way that we can tackle these synthetic or emergent patterns of risk that deal with both physical and digital systems? For example, person distracted by cell phone while driving car. Is that a physical security threat? Is that a digital security threat? It's a cognitive security threat because it's an emergent outcome of a cognitive system in their use of a cyber-physical niche. And so cognitive security and the framing of conflict that we provided in that paper helps us squarely target and center the cognitive phenomena as that which should be understood and secured, instead of relying on a physicalist description or a computational description of that system. Rather, we can bring the physical and the digital components into play by talking about the cognitive agent in the cyber-physical niche.
So cognitive security is a term that you brought up today. That it's not the first time I heard it. Actually, the first time I heard it was from you. We talk a lot about cognitive warfare, but I do like your description there of the iPhone or the phone going off in the car and getting distracted, and how that connects to all this.
Just one note on cognitive security. Of course, we can keep talking about this, but I would point people to a 2017 testimony by Rand Waltzman, The Weaponization of Information, the Need for Cognitive Security. So as he wanted to share it then, that is one of the documents that inspired RJ and I to work together in this area.
Oh, that's amazing. So the application, we got fifth generation warfare, we got teams, we have organizations dealing with VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. There are other applications of active inference that we're seeing, and this is pretty near and dear to my heart, and that is the application to PTSD and TBI in veterans, not just veterans, but first responders and anybody that faces some type of trauma. So we're starting to see a lot of use of the free energy principle and active inference there. Just saw a great paper by Eunice Ippolito on I forgot who the co-author was, but on autism to understand that. So neurodiversity, or am I saying that right? Neurodiversity. So understanding basically how we make sense, decide, and act in this world is at the core of active inference and understanding the free energy principle. So Daniel, what else can we look? What other domains are we seeing active inference and FEP pop up in?
Awesome. Yeah, I'll give one thought on this kind of human neuroscience and neurodiversity, and then we can explore maybe other areas.
Yeah.
So one cool thing about active inference is that given the generative model, we then unroll perception and decision making as Bayes optimal. So that doesn't mean, again, that the startup's going to work or that the person's behavior is socially accepted or that everything goes according to someone else's dream for it. It means that the ball rolls downhill according to how the model is set up. And so this is a slightly different way to think about neurodiversity, because instead of drawing some DSM line and saying, well, here's the pathology and here's not the pathology, normal and sick, or here's an evaluative criterion that's going to classify people in some other way, we can actually respect and open the conversation to these different axes of neurodiversity, including how they intersect and how they relate to environmental factors, without pathologizing or saying that some type of activity is irrational. No, it's rational. It's the ball rolling downhill given a different generative model. And so one of the most active areas of work is understanding various types of conditions and different kinds of cognitive phenomena, like you mentioned, autism and other topics that have been well researched include depression and other cognitive patterns, approaching those and not asking what is going wrong here, but rather what is different here and how does the optimal rolling out of how this group is different give rise to the sense-making and decision-making patterns that we observe. And that may lead to some unconventional suggestions about interventions or ways to modify the niche. So I think that's really positive because it helps us find continuity between accessibility and inclusion and taking a broad perspective, but also in high reliability systems, being able to really dial things in and make critical decisions. So I find that synthesis just qualitatively is very pleasing and allows us to have a value guided framework that also has a performance edge. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think as you're walking me through this, what came to mind is walking into an organization and helping them minimize free energy by showing them a little bit about active inference through an experiential learning activity or activities where they can see how they interact with the world and how that applies throughout their home life, their work life, and all that. So it scales, right? And then I think what ends up happening or could happen is people start to see the application to maybe artificial intelligence, maybe to big data or data, maybe to, like you brought up, startups. That's what it's two things. It's John Boyd's OODA loop gave us something that's very powerful that many people misunderstand. And active inference helps people understand that at another level, right? And that's my view on this. So if you could show folks these things through experiences, kind of like you did with the little, put your finger on a table or on a surface, that's a great explanation. That's an experience. And I go, oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. And if I can see that from an individual level, and I can see as a team, maybe I need to leverage weak signal detection within my organization, meaning that neurodiversity or cognitive diversity, I need to leverage that. What are the tools and techniques that allow us to do that? Because that's an intervention. And that way we can make sense of the external world, which each of us have a different perspective on. And I think that one of the concepts is we see the world from our advantage point, not necessarily our vantage point, but from our advantage point. And I get that from Robert Grant. So there's a lot of implications here in understanding active inference. And I think what makes it challenging, and this is my perspective, is there's a lot of math in it. And when I look at it, I just my eyes roll back and I'm like, oh my gosh, right? why am I looking at 20 pages of math? By the way, John Boyd did a lot of math years ago and gave us the energy maneuverability theory, and we can explain that today pretty well too. So I don't know. There's so much more we can unpack here.
Yeah, well, I would love to see a more rigorous John Boyd EM active connection. I think that's hot and high on the bounty list.
No kidding. You think
to
yeah, be insane.
Part
We'll
two.
find the right guys.
Yeah. The question about level of technical detail in math. There's so many layers to this question too. People are relatively comfortable looking at scatter plots and linear regressions.
Yes.
People are comfortable with t-tests and p-values. And so those techniques are from the 1900s and they're still absolutely valid. But if one needs to kind of pull that thorn out and add in a new thorn with Bayesian statistics, suffice to say, there's 1 million PhDs of technical detail that no human will dive into. However, everyone, just like we use numbers without necessarily getting caught up on number theory when we're at the store, we can do cognitive modeling at the store without being caught up in the actually infinite levels of technical detail. And then lastly, just to the areas of application. So we talked a lot today about organizational and personal, as well as psychiatric active inference applications, but just a few other areas that I think people might be interested to see the scope. Agroecology and understanding biosystems modeling, robotics, where it's important to have edge computing and the Internet of Things in this adaptive and real-time low compute setting, and also theoretical biology. So just understanding processes of learning and behavior, ecological succession, and evolutionary or intergenerational processes. So anywhere where you see living organisms, there's something active that could be happening there, or at least you could be modeling it that way. But those are some exciting areas that people are looking into.
Hey, Daniel, I want to wrap this up for our podcast, the audio portion anyway, and we'll invite our guests and listeners to stay on and move over to YouTube into our No Way Out extras. But before we conclude this portion of the podcast, the audio part anyway, how can our listeners get in touch with you, and what's on the horizon for you and the Active Inference Institute?
Sure, thank you. I would point people to two places. First, if you would like to learn and apply active inference, please head over to the Active Inference Institute, activeinference.org. All backgrounds, all perspectives are welcome. So we'll very much look forward to having you participate in the ecosystem, because there's so many things happening. And surely, even if you listen to this tomorrow, not July 12th, 2023, you'll find different information on that site and different things happening at the Institute. So just head over there whenever you hear it, and that's going to be the best way to get involved. And secondly, I would point people to cogsec.org, COGSEC, to learn more about our work in cognitive security and to catch up on our previous research initiatives and contribute to our ongoing work.
Awesome, Daniel. I really appreciate your time today. And like I said, we'll continue the conversation here in a moment.
Okay.
All right. Hey, that was awesome. So a couple things that are popping up in my head, a lot of connections to constructal law. I think you and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. There's so many connections here, and I think that's a good thing and a curse and a blessing, right? The affordances, we didn't cover that today. I think affordances are starting to make more sense to me too. Hopefully we can get that out there. Yeah, man. So your paper is pretty solid. Effects-based operations. The reason I brought that up during the show is EBO was built off of value-focused thinking in the military, right? It's domain. It has a context. It doesn't work everywhere, and I think that's what you tried to show in your paper, and I think that's what you're trying to show with the you call it the Rumsfeld quadrants. I think the paper is spot on. I mean, you got a lot of. I wish we could collaborate on a paper like that, because my background in the military, being a joint qualified officer, going through all the joint professional military education and all that, I think it would be awesome. Your use of bolts, I think it's what do you call it? Business, operation, legal, technical, and social. That's a nice. Where'd you get that model, by the way?
Thanks. Let me just give a few comments on this. So first, to bolts, Scott David is an incredible fellow. And he has been using the BOLTS acronym for years, not as necessarily exhaustive or final, but it's really a call towards holistic systems understanding.
Yeah.
Because if you are going to do some kind of activity and it makes sense from a business operations, legal, and technical side, but it's socially not palatable, or it's legally outlawed,
Hmm.
but it's palatable across the other domains, or it's not financially successful, one can see that the total success and the total security of an activity needs to be considered in this increasingly transdisciplinary way. Someone like doing a social media campaign that then threatens the business success, and then the
Yes.
business success causes a cascading failure and imperils a legal status. These are all real world phenomena. So Boltz helps us recognize interdependencies
Yes.
across what might be different like departments at an organization. Um, and then just to the EBO. So that's awesome about your background. And I only know what I know from the ants on the ground.
Yeah.
In figure 5 on page 29, we used a kind of quadrant representation. And on the
Yes.
y-axis, we had the continuum from tactical and operational up through strategic and scholarship. So that's sort of like the geopolitic, like big picture, grand game status.
Hmm.
Whereas tactical and operational is very syntactic and it's very like last mile and detail oriented, and therefore it relies on context like you described. And then on the x-axis, we have the continuum from qualitative
Gotcha.
frameworks, ones that you can just sketch out or describe verbally, to quantitative frameworks where you can talk about them for sure or not, but they are ultimately represented by a technical representation. And so we put effects-based operation in the quadrant that was more tactical and operational, more quantitative and formalized. And
All
so
right. Spot
that's a beautiful place to be. There's nothing wrong with any place on the quadrant, but the openings that make that more powerful are to combine the quantitative with the qualitative to make it
on.
more accessible and applicable, and to zoom out beyond the tactical and operational into the strategic setting.
Yeah. Okay. So I love it. With using Cynefin, the Cynefin framework, we would generally put EBO on the ordered domain side. So that would be where we have known unknowns. We not the unknown unknown side. And what happened 6 years ago is the military recognized EBO is not, you can't peanut butter spread it across everything. It doesn't work everywhere, even though we try to apply it that way. And the reason for it is, I'd say complex adaptive systems, right? Relationship between cause and effect isn't known until it's retrospective coherence that gets us there. So I love that. That's making sense. Hey, on the Rumsfeld matrix, one thing I learned about the Rumsfeld matrix, I saw Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, come to Montgomery when I was there in 2006, and he got up on stage and started talking about mumbo jumbo about known knowns, known unknowns, unknown, and all that good stuff, right? It wasn't until I met Dave Snowden years later where I asked him about that, and the connection is pretty interesting. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but Admiral Poindexter was working with Dave Snowden, and this is where on knowledge management, how you bring disparate information sources together. This is where you get into fitness landscapes and things like that. I think you're familiar with that quite a bit. But that evolved into the Cynefin framework, and that's where Rumsfeld picked up on this known thing. So it's very powerful. And what we were able to do with the flow system book is take the dominant pathways of John Boyd's OODA loop and put them within four of the five domains of the Cynefin framework, right? Which is pretty cool. So what I believe is if we dive into that, we would see something that looks like active inference in the complex domain, and then that autonomic response more in the ordered side or the clear and complicated domains. And I think that's something that we could look at down the road. I put it up on my board behind me. It's over my shoulder here. I think I need to update it based on what we're learning from active inference. So there's a lot there.
Yes, I would also eagerly look forward to Cynefin active. One point about the Rumsfeld quadrant that was very interesting to consider in terms of this blind spot discussion we had earlier.
Yeah.
Everyone knows about known knowns, unknown unknowns, and known unknowns. And in fact, those are the only three quadrants that Rumsfeld mentioned in his
Yes.
famous quote.
Yeah.
The fourth quadrant was actually not even mentioned. And I
Right.
think it reflects an area of blind spots, and that's the unknown knowns. So those we described in our paper as the factors that a system is not currently aware of implications of, but has knowledge of. For example,
But has
the
knowledge of. Say that again.
yeah,
Okay.
you could know every single part of, the serial number on every part in your car,
Hmm.
but their emergent operating outcomes would be like unknown knowns. And there would be basically, there's a wrapper of the unknown around the known. So now, again,
Hmm.
this is just a qualitative framework because one can
Yeah.
say that that's also a known unknown. And that is our bigger point about the need to integrate these qualitative heuristics
Yeah.
with more formal representations, because when it stays just schematic and linguistic, then we can think about that as many ways as we can write a poem.
Okay.
And
Let me ask you
yeah,
this. On the qualitative side, are you looking like at narratives and stories, or what do you mean?
yes, that's a very
Okay.
interesting question. So in 2021, our CogSec research initiative was narrative information management, and so we
Okay.
basically looked at the role of narrative in cognition and about the kinds of computer systems that are able to represent that information, narrative information, and about management of narrative information. And so, yes, it contains qualitative and quantitative aspects in play, but as experienced by the cognitive agents, which is what we're always going for, this kind of dual view from the inside, cognitive decision making, view from the outside, behavioral researcher view. Having both of those views, taking a look from both sides of the Markov blanket, gives continuity and resolves a lot of either or discussions. Because, yeah, a narrative as qualitatively experienced is qualitative and experiential,
Hmm.
whereas a narrative quantified, maybe using a large language model to find the embedding of a narrative or using other kinds of rhetorical analysis techniques to break down that narrative into more quantified parts, then of course that's quantitative. And so when we have the view from the inside and the view from the outside, we often find that the view from the inside is qualitative because that's the information that we access moment to moment,
Hmm.
whereas the view from the outside, almost by necessity, must be quantitative and formalized.
So let me try to frame this. If I'm hearing you correctly, the if you're inside the system, inside of an organization, the qualitative data might be more important to you to understand what's going on.
From inside whatever blanket you're in,
Yeah. Yeah.
the qualitative. Now, you may be in an organization dealing with, qualitative
Mhm.
information within your blanket. It absolutely could be that way.
So think of like culture of your organization, getting the leading indicators of what could happen when we interact with the external environment. If the stories we're hearing inside the blanket, inside an organization, the stories tell us a lot. The narratives tell us a lot about what's going on. So this is important to me because we a lot of the military, most organizations, they depend on quantitative data from a survey to figure out what's going on inside their organization. And our argument is you need to collect both the qualitative, the narrative, the stories, those things that provide context, and get the quantitative data from there. And that's what Dave Snowden has taught us as well through the Connected framework. And I think is that the same conclusion you're coming to?
Yeah, Dave's
Okay.
work on narrative is certainly fascinating in this area. But just to give an
Mhm.
example of why this matters and why being able to quantify it
Mhm.
without bleeding it out is so important. Um, Narrative or culture is kind of like the highest leverage point organizing principle all the way on down to the last mile or the visual perception. I mean, if we know that we're watching a comedy versus a documentary versus a tragedy, that is going to help us reduce our uncertainty, bound our surprise, update our
Mhm.
generative model about what color palette we might see, about what music we might hear, about what kind of conversation or what kind of characters might come into play, and about how people react to different situations. And so we can think about everything from the forest fire alert system
Yes.
to other color-based warning systems, other kinds of situational awareness cues, other kinds of contextual information that's provided in a top-down way that sets the highest constraint, and it also enables agency to be pushed out to the edge more legibly and transparently. But if you have different commanders in the field, and one thinks that it's a rom-com, and one thinks that it's this kind of movie, and one thinks it's this kind of movie, they're going to be not just on different scripts, they're going to be in different story universes. Whereas the question for adaptive organizations would be like, what is the meta narrative that enables different nestmates in different locations to have their own qualitative narratives that are authentic and adaptive, respect their neurodiversity, and yet also playing an adaptive role within the quantitative higher level constraints of the organization.
Okay. Okay. I want to just going back to your conflict paper. I can't remember the exact phrase you put in here, but um, the application of, I can't remember if it was active inference or the OODA loop. I think it was OODA loop applied to an individual agent, to just like a person like me, right? Um, I think you're struggling. Not you're struggling. I think we're all struggling with how do you apply the John Boyd's OODA loop to a team, right? How do you apply it to an organization? Because you have these individuals that have a Markov blanket that are interacting with their environment, and it's the same environment, and constructing their own reality. How do you scale that up? And I think we had this conversation with Chet Richards, who worked with John Boyd, and we also had a conversation with G.I. Wilson about this. And the John Boyd did not want the way he wrote orientation with genetics, maybe culture. He did not want those in there for the team. So he started working on something else, and I believe we need to figure out what that something else ought to be. One of the things he gave us was IOHAI, IOHI. It's insight, orientation, harmony, agility, and initiative, right? So that's what he's saying. You put it as the orientation of the team. And this goes back to your point about folks viewing the comedy differently and all that. So how do you get that alignment, or excuse me, that agility, that harmony, not necessarily alignment, but harmony. And I think harmony, there's a different definition of harmony than alignment. So on that, when you start thinking about scaling either active inference or OODA loop up to a team organization, do you have any ideas on what you would put within the internal model, which we call orientation? What are those components that you would want to see in there?
That's a great question. As an organizer, I almost defer and prefer to build tools that would allow people to hot swap their preferred stances and orientations. So if somebody wants to use IOHAI and somebody else wants to use IOH or wants to use, ABCDEFG, that's up to them. And that is the amazing thing, is by designing the articulation from the general to the specific, then we can talk about a team that has different priorities ranked differently. But the one point I'll add from the active inference ontology there is we talk about the concept of generalized synchrony. Now, generalized synchrony does not mean lockstep, identical, conformant behavior.
Right.
Saying the same thing at the same time is an example of generalized synchrony, but also turn taking is an example of generalized synchrony, because still the activity patterns of one agent have perfect mutual information on the other, whether they're saying the same thing or whether they're very nicely taking turns. And so generalized synchrony can help us understand the actual complementarities of a team and then be explicit about the kinds of communication and interactions that we expect and prefer. And in terms of how to apply the OODA or ACT-INF to a team, well, as you described, first, the composition of the team are the human with their own associated blankets, but then the team inbound information might reflect their chat workspace or their contact form, and then as well as the individual Markov blankets rising information up. And then the team action describes not just actions that the individuals take as individuals, but also any actions that might be authorized by the team. And so we can think about the kind of informational and decision-making inputs, outputs of the individuals. And then that supports the discussion of what is then enabled in terms of team informational inputs, observations, and team decision-making. And that conversation supports the team level OODA or OCTINF.
Okay, awesome. I got one last question for you. This goes back to Adrian Bejan's work on flow systems and constructal law. So, as we're talking today, if you think about from the context of the constructal law, we have design and currency. The currency within active inference is information. Can I say that?
Let's go with it.
Or surprise. I mean, it's information from information theory. So that's important. Design would be the design. It's a noun. It's how the system is designed to improve the flow of that information. And I think when you read through some of the papers that are out there, minimal unifying model, right? It's the minimum amount you need to understand a flow system. And if you think about humans are flow systems. We have input, we have a boundary, and we have an output, right? And I think that's the same thing that the active model gives us as well. Can you amplify or dampen that, or provide some insights on what I just shared with you? Is there alignment there or overlap?
Yes, minimizing.
Yeah.
Minimum unifying models.
Minimum.
Input, output, and blanket. If you have one of those pieces removed, you're missing something fundamental in terms of the input, the boundary, or the output. And if you add something in, it's not that it isn't important in a given situation. It's just an elaboration you add in. For example, that minimum unifying model doesn't include cognitive phenomena like explicit planning or attention. So the minimum, nothing can be removed without damaging the integrity of the framework, but then it can be elaborated in all these different settings. And inheriting from this minimal framework is the idea of a common currency or format, which is informational, which you pointed to, and a joint imperative, which is free energy minimization. So rather than reward or utility maximization being an imperative for systems, this minimum unifying model enables us to center free energy minimization as the joint imperative of sense-making, signal processing, action selection, and control theory. And so it turns out that if we take this seriously, that minimum unifying structural model of a flow system naturally provides a tractable and optimizable way to then parameterize that system.
Okay. And as agents, we have a choice, right? We can stay in a stuck state. Let me see. We can change our mind. We can basically adapt to the external environment, or we can change the external environment. Are there any other actions we can take to stay far from equilibrium?
These are called the autonomous states, and they are your internal states and your action states. Change your mind broadly includes perception, learning, attention, cognitive changes and activities, which also, as you pointed to earlier, are modeled as covert actions because they are not grossly visible. In contrast, action is overt action, and that reflects the re-engagement with the niche. And so you're correct in saying that the two ways that the agent has to minimize free energy, which, as we discussed earlier, is equivalent to bounding surprise, maximizing model evidence, reducing the differential. The two ways that we have to do that are changing the mind through covert action, changing the world through overt action.
Okay, that's simple. I like it. That's great. And then real world examples. I think we're starting to see organizations try to. So going back to Connect, we want to probe, right? We want in a complex environment, we probe first. We don't just come out and go big. I think that's a problem that military has had over the years. Is we try to do everything, and that's 20 years to develop a new toilet bowl or whatever. But today, organizations and people that have an internal model that it's not to say it doesn't match the external world. It's just it's that adjacent possible or that attractor state or however you want to look at it. And I think we called it adjacent possibles. Within a complex system, we try to move from a possibility to a possibility. When if you take a look at older approaches to like defining a high definition destination, a future end state, and trying to close the gap from what you think the world ought to be to what's actually possible, you end up with potential failures in organizations. And I believe the active inference model helps us understand that we, when combined with complex adaptive systems thinking, we can't necessarily emit an action on the external world that isn't possible in the near future. It could be possible 20 years, 30 years, 50 years down the road, but we have to be mindful of the other constraints that are provided to us through complex adaptive systems. I'm just bringing that up because that's what we're kind of seeing in the environment now with organizations trying to change too much, too quickly. But I just kind of want to get your take on that.
Oh, yeah. Well, affordances represent
Yeah.
the capacities for action at a given moment. And
okay.
Affordances are agent specific. For example, if there's a coffee cup that weighs 5,000 pounds, it might be an affordance to pick it up for a giant, but not for a human. And so affordances are not simply out there. Affordances are relational and contextual. And so just like if we were going to drive from A to B and we had to go over an area where there wasn't a road, it's not a valid path. And so sequences of actions over a given time horizon, policy, must be strung together by actions that can be taken as adjacent possibles in each moment. If you're speculating about, well, we're going to go, 1 mile north, 1 mile north, then we're going to teleport 5,000 miles east, and then we're going to go 1 mile north and then 1 mile north, that's not a valid walking path. Mm-hmm. And so being able to, again, with a quantitative and formal lens, talk about adjacent possibilities, affordances, the impact of making decisions and changing niches, this is where it all comes together.
Okay. Hey, Daniel, I know we're coming up on time here. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. I appreciate your help, and I'll keep you on for a few more minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.